We're now at the halfway point in this course. What we've done so far is outline the contours of the rationalism versus empiricism and realism versus idealism debates. By thinking through the philosophies of Descartes, Locke, and Berkeley, we've tried to identify the prospects and also the challenges for rationalism, empiricism, realism, and idealism. What we're going to do in the second half of this course is look at the most sophisticated rationalist, empiricist, and idealist philosophers of the modern period. We'll look at Leibniz's defense of rationalism, Hume's defense of empiricism, and Kant's defense of idealism. And by looking at these most sophisticated adherents to rationalism, empiricism, and idealism, I think we'll be able to make our final decision on the tenability of these various positions. This week and next, we'll be looking at Leibniz's defense of rationalism. What we learned from our study of Descartes was that rationalism is the thesis that not all our knowledge derives from the senses. Instead, there is some non-sensory source of knowledge. For Descartes, the non-sensory source of knowledge was simple intuition of the mind. For Leibniz, by contrast, the non-empirical source of knowledge is the principle of sufficient reason. On page 209 of our text, Leibniz writes, "We rise to metaphysics by making use of that great principle that nothing takes place without sufficient reason. That is, that nothing happens without it being possible for someone who knows enough things to give a reason sufficient to determine why it is so and not otherwise." So the principle of sufficient reason states, if something is when it might not have been, and if it is some way when it might have been some other way, then there must be a reason that suffices to explain why the thing is, rather than not being, and why it is the way that it is, rather than being another way. The principle of sufficient reason is a basic commitment to the intelligibility of things, or the explicability, or the understandability. So for example, if I told you that I had two glasses, the same size, made of the same material, and I filled them both with the same amounts of water, and then when I struck one with a spoon, it emitted a sound of A, and when I struck the other with a spoon, it emitted a sound of C sharp, would you accept what I'm saying? Or for a similar example, if I had two rocks, I told you that both were gold, and that both had the same volume, but when I put them on the scale, one weighs more than the other, would you accept what I'm saying? I think you wouldn't. I think you would demand an explanation. You would insist that there's a reason why one rock weighs more than the other, or why one glass emits a different sound than the other. In the case of the rocks, if they were indeed the same volume, you would insist that they were different kinds of rock, and that one had a higher density than the other. And what you'd be doing here is you would be demanding a reason to explain why one rock weighs more than the other. But now, imagine another case in which you just have a single rock. It has a given volume, and when you put it on the scale, it has a given weight. The thought is, the rock might have had a different weight, and so you'll demand a reason that explains why the rock has the weight that it has. The point is that we demand a reason not just to explain why two actual things are different from one another, but also to explain why some actual thing is different from another way that it might possibly have been. Can you imagine that there's a natural phenomenon that has no explanation? In other words, can you imagine finding something in nature where there's no explanation for why that thing exists? If you'd be unwilling to countenance such an unexplicable phenomenon, then you're committed to the principle of sufficient reason. Leibniz thinks we all have an implicit commitment to the intelligibility of things. If you left the glass of water on your desk, walked away and came back, and found that the water was boiling, you would have a right to know what made it boil. If you were told that there's no reason why the water's boiling, that the water just inexplicably started boiling, I think you would reject this. You would insist that if something's happening, there must be a reason that explains why it's happening. There simply aren't inexplicable phenomena. Now, Leibniz uses the principle of sufficient reason in a proof for God's existence. This is on page 210. Leibniz writes, assuming this principle, the first question we have a right to ask will be, why is there something rather than nothing? Furthermore, assuming that things exist, we must be able to give a reason for why they must exist in this way and not otherwise. He continues, this sufficient reason for the existence of the universe cannot be found in the series of contingent things. For, since matter is in itself indifferent to motion and rest, and to one motion rather than another, we cannot find in matter the reason for motion, still less the reason for a particular motion. And although the present motion found in matter comes from the preceding motion, and it in turn comes from a preceding motion, we will not make any progress in this way, however far back we go, for the same question always remains. Thus, the sufficient reason, which needs no other reason, must be outside this series of contingent things, and must be found in a substance, which is its own cause, and which is a necessary being, carrying the reason for its existence within itself. Otherwise, we would not yet have a sufficient reason where one could end the series. And this ultimate reason for things is called God. Now, I think this is actually a very sophisticated argument, but I think it can be easily confused with a much less sophisticated argument given by Aristotle for an unmoved mover. Aristotle's argument goes, take something that's moving, call it Z. Z couldn't be moving unless it was moved by something else, call it y. But y can't move z unless y itself is moving. So since y is moving, there must be something that pushed it. Call it x. But now the same goes for x. It couldn't move y unless it were itself moving, but it couldn't be moving unless something moved it. Now, Aristotle concludes that the only way we can avoid an infinite series is by assuming that there is some unmoved mover. But now, I think there's two obvious problems with this sort of argument. The first is, why couldn't there be an infinite series? Second, if we suppose that z can't be moving unless it was moved by something else, some other y, then why are we allowed to suppose that the unmoved mover moves itself? How is it that the unmoved mover gets to move without being moved by something other than itself? Now, when Leibniz writes, the present motion found in matter comes from the preceding motion, and it in turn comes from a preceding motion. Though we will not make any progress in this way, however far back we go, it might seem as though Leibniz is giving the same argument as Aristotle, but I don't think he is. What Leibniz is asking about is not the reason for any particular motion, but a reason for the whole series of movements that makes up the entire history of the universe. What Leibniz is asking for is the sufficient reason for the existence of the universe itself. Leibniz's point is that the entire history of the universe is a series of causal interactions. If z is happening now, it was caused by some y, and y was caused by some x. And this series might be finite, or it might go on infinitely. The point is, the series could have been different. A different set of things could possibly have existed, and there could have been different causal laws that govern them. In this way, then, something that is one way when it could have been another way is the entire universe. The universe itself. And now, principle of sufficient reason states that whenever anything is one way when it might have been another way, there must be a reason that explains why the thing is that way. Leibniz's thought here is that we're all implicitly committed to that principle. That's what my earlier examples was meant to bring out. We wouldn't allow one set of phenomena to be governed by the principle of sufficient reason, while another set of phenomena is exempt from this principle. We wouldn't say that there's always a reason why rocks weigh what they weigh, but there isn't a reason why water boils. Instead, the principle of sufficient reason applies to anything that happens when it might not have happened, or anything that is when it might not have been. So what Leibniz is trying to point out is that the entire universe is something that is when it might have been some other way. And indeed, Leibniz suggests that the universe might not have existed. There is a universe, and there might have been nothing. And now, Leibniz's claim is that the only thing that could serve as the sufficient reason for the existence and the nature of the entire universe is God. And this is because, while the universe is a contingent thing, God is defined as a necessary being. So now, I think we can see how Leibniz avoids both of the problems with Aristotle's unmoved mover argument. First off, Leibniz doesn't assume that the universe can't be an infinite causal chain. Leibniz explicitly allows that the universe might be infinitely large. His point is simply that the universe is contingent. It could have been otherwise. The second problem with Aristotle's argument was that it was unclear why the unmoved mover was allowed to be self-moving when nothing else is allowed to be self-moving. But I don't think Leibniz makes this kind of error either. For Leibniz, there must be a reason for anything that could have been otherwise. That's what the principle of sufficient reason states. Everything that exists contingently requires a reason. The universe might not have existed. There could have been nothing. And moreover, the universe could have been a different way. It could have had different laws or different constituents. So the universe needs a reason to explain why it is and why it is the way that it is. But now, a necessary being doesn't need a reason outside of itself to explain why it is the way it is, since a necessary being couldn't have been any other way. That's what it means to be a necessary being. A necessary being is a being that has to exist and has to be the way that it is. And so there isn't any room for a reason to explain why this being is the way that it is, since there's no other way it might have been. So really, what Leibniz's argument shows is that if we think the universe is contingent, and if we're committed to the principle of sufficient reason, then we have to be committed to the existence of a necessary being. Here then is Leibniz's proof for God's existence. Premise 1 is the PSR. Premise 2 is that the universe exists contingently. The conclusion is that there must be something that exists necessarily that provides the reason for the universe existing. And for Leibniz, this is by definition God. Now Leibniz thinks we're all implicitly committed to premise 1, and premise 2 seems hard to deny. That is, it seems hard to maintain the universe exists necessarily. So does it follow from these two premises that God exists? One question is how close Leibniz's definition of God is to the more traditional conception of God that's found in Descartes, for example. What Leibniz has shown exists is a necessary being that provides the reason for the universe. So the question is how close is this to God, traditionally conceived? I think Leibniz is aware of this question, and he wants to provide an argument that the more traditional Cartesian conception of God is the wrong way of thinking about God, and that his conception of God is closer to the idea of a perfect being. On page 35 of our text, Leibniz begins his discourse on method by writing, "The most widely accepted and meaningful notion we have of God is expressed well through the words that God is a perfect being." So Leibniz thinks it's agreed on all sides that God is a perfect being. But then Leibniz writes, "Yet the consequences of these words are not sufficiently considered." So Leibniz thinks, while everyone, including Descartes, conceives of God as a perfect being, Leibniz thinks that the traditional and the Cartesian conceptions of God have misunderstood what it is to be a perfect being. Descartes spells out his more traditional conception of God on page 93 of the Meditations. Descartes writes, "There is not any priority of order such that God's idea of the good impelled him to choose one thing rather than another. For example, God did not will the 3 angles of a triangle should be equal to 2 right angles, because he recognized that it could not be otherwise. On the contrary, it's because he willed that the 3 angles of a triangle should necessarily equal 2 right angles that this is true and cannot be otherwise." So in this passage, what Descartes is asking us to consider is what comes first, God's power to choose or God's knowledge of what's true and what's good? In other words, what comes first in the order of explanation, God's will or God's intellect? Is it that God chooses for the internal angles of a triangle to sum to 180 degrees, and that because God chooses this, it's the case that the internal angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees? Or alternatively, is it that God knows that the internal angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees, and that God's knowledge of this is the reason why God creates triangles such that their internal angles sum to 180 degrees? The question is, what explains what? Is the fact that the internal angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees explained by God's choice to create triangles having internal angles summing to 180 degrees? Or is it the other way around? Is God's choice to create triangles such that their internal angles sum to 180 degrees explained by God's prior knowledge of the fact that the internal angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees? Descartes clearly opts for the former. Descartes denies that God's idea of the good impelled him to choose one thing rather than another. Now, why does Descartes say this? Descartes' motivation seems to be respecting God's power, or his omnipotence, or his freedom to choose. Descartes' thought is that a perfect being is a being that can do literally anything. So God could have made the internal angles of a triangle sum to 360 degrees. Descartes thinks saying anything other than this would limit God's power or God's freedom. But now Leibniz takes the opposite position on page 36 of our text. He contradicts Descartes, saying, "I am far removed from the opinion of those who maintain that there are no rules of goodness and perfection in the nature of things, or in the ideas God has of them, and who say that the works of God are good solely for the reason that God has made them." Now, what's Leibniz's argument against Descartes? Later on in this paragraph, he writes, "In saying that things are not good by virtue of any rule of goodness, but solely by virtue of the will of God, it seems to me that we unknowingly destroy all of God's love and all his glory. For why praise him for what he has done, if he would be equally praiseworthy in doing the exact contrary? Where will his justice and wisdom reside, if there remains only a certain despotic power, if will holds the place of reason, and if, according to the definition of tyrants, justice consists in whatever pleases the most powerful?" Leibniz concludes, "That is why I find completely strange the expression of some other philosophers who say that the eternal truths of metaphysics and geometry, and consequently also the rules of goodness, justice, and perfection, are merely the effects of the will of God. Instead," Leibniz writes, "it seems to me they are only the consequences of his understanding, which, assuredly, does not depend on his will." So Leibniz's thought here is that if we conceive of God's omnipotence in the way that Descartes does, we entirely do away with God's omniscience and God's omnibenevolence, and hence we do away with the idea of God as a perfect being. So Leibniz's thought here is that an agent counts as good if that agent does what is right instead of doing what is wrong, and a mind counts as intelligent if that mind knows the truth when it might have been ignorant or believed the false. But now, Leibniz points out, if we conceive of God's power in the way that Descartes does, then we rule out the possibility of conceiving of God as being either a good agent or an intelligent mind. So the thought is, if whatever God does counts as good simply because God did it, then God could never have a reason for doing what God does. And by the same token, if the internal angles of a triangle sum to whatever God chooses for them to sum to, God could never have a reason for making them sum to one thing rather than another. And what Leibniz points out is that in these two cases, we would have no room to label God benevolent or wise. So Leibniz's thought is that if, in the order of explanation, God's will precedes God's intelligence. Then, while we can say that God is omnipotent, we can't say that God is omniscient or omnibenevolent. By contrast, Leibniz thinks, if we say that God's intellect precedes God's will, then we can say that God is omniscient and omnibenevolent. And Leibniz thinks there's still room to say that God is omnipotent. For Leibniz, God's omnipotence consists in God's power to do everything that God has a reason to do. So God is omnipotent for Leibniz, not in the Cartesian sense that God can do literally anything, but rather in the sense that God can do everything that God has most reason to do. And now, this is the conception of God that follows from Leibniz's proof. God, for Leibniz, is a being that, from within its own nature, provides a reason for everything that doesn't have a reason for itself in its own nature. God's a necessary being that rationalizes all contingent beings. Now, the next claim that Leibniz advances is, nor can I approve of the opinion of some moderns who maintain boldly that what God has made is not of the highest perfection, and that he could have done much better. This is Leibniz's thesis, that God creates the best of all possible worlds. What we've seen so far is that the universe, and everything in it, exists contingently, and therefore there must be a reason for the universe existing, and existing in the way that it does, and for all of the things in the universe existing, and existing in the way that they do. And we've seen that for Leibniz, God provides the reason. But now, what is the reason? Why does the universe exist? Leibniz's answer here is that the explanation for the universe existing is God's creating the best of all possible worlds. So the universe exists because God created it, but God didn't create just any old universe that God chose to create. Instead, God was impelled to choose to create the universe that exists by God's knowledge of the best universe to create. So the thought is, there are many other ways the world could possibly have been. There are many possible worlds. And Leibniz's thought is that because God knows which world among all these possible worlds is the best, that's why God created the world that exists. Now consider, what does best mean in this context? How is our world the best of all the possible worlds? Best on what metric? Here, I think Leibniz waffles. On 38, Leibniz suggests that the best of all possible worlds is the world that contains the most virtues. But then in the next sentence, Leibniz suggests that the best of all possible worlds is the world with the most happiness. Now, I find it hard to believe that there couldn't be more virtue and more happiness in the world. But then on 39, Leibniz offers a third criterion of bestness. He says that God has chosen the most perfect world, that is, the one which is at the same time the simplest in hypotheses and the richest in phenomena. This notion of bestness isn't cashed out in human terms at all, but in strictly rational terms. The thought is, what makes an explanation satisfying is when it takes a number of seemingly disparate and diverse phenomena and then posits a single law that explains all those phenomena. So now, in writing your papers, I want you to consider both how convincing is Leibniz's proof for God's existence, and also how convincing is Leibniz's thesis that God creates the best of all possible worlds. Do you think that there's a conception of bestness that is most defensible?